بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدات والسادة أصدقاء الدار، أسعد الله مساءكم بكل خير. يسرنا استقبالكم هذا المساء في مركز اليرموك الثقافي، معلنين بعد الاستعانة بالله ابتداء الموسم الثقافي الثالث والعشرون لدار الآثار الإسلامية باسم المشرف العام للدار الشيخ حصة صباح السالم الصباح، وباسم جميع العاملين بالدار والمتطوعين بها، أرحب بكم أجمل ترحيب، متمنيا أن تستمتعوا بما سنقدمه لكم في هذا الموسم من أنشطة مختلفة تشمل المحاضرات القيمة والأمسيات الموسيقية الممتعة والأفلام الجيدة والأنشطة المخصصة للأطفال وأمسيات الكتاب والشعر وغير ذلك كثير. نأمل أن نراكم أعضاء في الدار تشدوا من أزرنا ونستمتع بحضوركم. وعلى بركة الله نبدأ هذا المساء. Friends of the Dar, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight we start the first lecture of the 23rd cultural season of Dar al-Athar Islamiyyah. On behalf of the Director General of the Dar, Sheikh Hussa Sabah Salim Sabah, and all of us here, I welcome you. The 22nd cultural season was quite rich and varied. The lecturers were informative, the music was lively and entertaining, the other activities were wide-ranged, the children's programs were very successful and continued to be throughout the summer. The 23rd season promises to be even more so, if that is possible. You will believe me when you review the program. As is our custom for the first lecture of the season, Dar al-Athar Islamiyyah is happy to be receiving a talk from the Tareq Sayid Rajab Museum in Kuwait. The Sabah collection has an affinity with that museum. The collections of both developed from the hands-on efforts of their founders. Both were endangered during the horrific events of 1990-1991. Most importantly, both survived and are active even more than before. Dr. Ziad Rajab, the son of the late founders, has delighted us in recent past seasons with a number of lectures on a variety of subjects based on the complexity of the collection. They include an extensive number of items in the museum, ranging from Islamic artifacts and ethnographic objects. Many of you will remember his speaking about his parents. His father, Tareq Sayid Rajab, collector, artist, and archaeologist, founded both the Tareq Rajab Museum and the New English School. Another talk was about his mother's fascinating life and her dedicated study of the Middle East and her intense involvement in both institutions. Dr. Ziad is a descendant of one of the first teachers at the Mubarakiyah School. Among his other activities, he is the director of the New English School and the board member of the museum. His previous lectures are available online. Tonight, he will be discussing Incense Burners in the Tareq Rajab Museum. The Tareq Rajab Museum is in Jabriya. If you have not been there yet, I highly recommend that you visit. It is rich in contents. Two of the items that are only shown at the museum and nowhere else are portraits of a controversial personality, Lady Jane Digby, also known as Lebanon, as well as her husband, Sheikh Mijwal. There are many other interesting objects at the museum, but thank God there are no images of mobile phones there. So that should give you a hint to turn off your mobile phones. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ziad Sayid Rajab.
Thanks. I can't see, of course, so I'm guessing Sheikh Hissa, you're there. Sheikh Hissa and friends and guests, thank you very much for having me this evening. For the past few years, it's been a great honor to be invited here to give this first talk. And I have to say that apart from being an honor, it's also actually quite a pleasure, because whenever I prepare for a talk, and of course I spend every year after each talk, I tell my family, my sister and so on, I said, I have to pick a subject now, and I have to start working on it now. And then the year goes by, the months pass by, and it becomes March and April, and I start to panic. What shall I do? What shall I talk about? And usually I decide by May, because Sheikh Hissa sends me an email saying, what's your subject this year? So I have to panic, pick a subject, and that's it. But it really gives me a real opportunity, because as I'm sure you all know, I'm not really an art historian, although I'm very interested and I love history. But I'm not really an expert in the field. So it really gives me an opportunity to study the objects in the museum and also to learn a lot about the history surrounding not only the objects, but the region. I'm sure you could all smell the beautiful bukhur when you came in here, and Kuwaitis, of course, but everybody who lives in Kuwait knows that bukhur is an essential part of Kuwaiti life. And not only Kuwaiti life, but the whole Gulf. And in fact, once I was in Singapore, and I went to Arab Street, where they have all the bukhur sellers, and some of them were Kuwaitis in the past. And there's one, Lijnaid. I always go to him because he has very nice bukhur. And so one day I was chatting to him, and I said, so who are your biggest customers? And he said, number one customers, Kuwaitis. Number two customers, Japanese, which I was surprised about. But he says they use them in their temples in Japan. And then he said after that, it's the rest of the Gulf countries. And so you smelt, thank you to Al-Dar, the beautiful bukhur as you are coming in, which is a feature not only of Kuwait, but has been a feature of the region, the whole region, for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. And the Arabians, apart from producing the incense thousands of years ago, also controlled the trade routes in South Arabia, through Arabia, along the Gulf Coast and the Red Sea coast, which at one point in time was called the Arabian Gulf. And so reading about this, I mean, you know, I've discovered, I knew a little, but I've found out so much more about vanished cultures in the region, which I'm sure most people have never heard of. Very interesting cultures, little kingdoms and principalities and city-states. And the other thing that struck me was how similar 2,000 or 3,000 years ago the situation was to today. So now we're oil states, some big ones, some small ones, mostly centered around the Gulf, extremely wealthy, have quite strategic influence in the world. And thousands of years ago, it was a similar picture, but the oil in those days was incense. So you had extremely wealthy little kingdoms, some of them which went into fable and myth. And these kingdoms were really the focus of a lot of trade in the old world. And the Greeks and Romans used to call Arabia Felix. And although nobody really knows, I forgot I've got slides, although nobody really knows exactly why it was called that, but most scholars and most people generally agree that it's because they were referring to the prosperity of the people. And as a little aside, I was reading an article, a book by a scholar called Jan Retzo, who did a lot of work on the incense trade. And he said Arabia Felix actually, his theory is used to refer to the Gulf Coast and Bahrain. And his reasoning behind that was that the Sumerians, of course, to them, Dilmun, which included Failaka, of course, in Kuwait, was the paradise which every person would like to go to. And so originally it started off as Arabia Felix in Bahrain and the Gulf Coast, which one philosopher, who you could see here, Euhemeros, who is from the Macedonian court of the 4th century BC, he wrote about the region, and he claimed to have traveled down the Gulf Coast, along the coast of South Arabia, and up the Arabian Gulf, visiting the islands, which naturally must have included Failaka and Bahrain. And he referred to it as Eudaimon Arabia, so happy Arabia. And then Retzo then went on to say that it gradually, by the time of Pliny and Strabo in the 1st century AD, started to refer to the whole Arabian Peninsula and finally just the Yemen. So happy Arabia is actually where we are now. And so the Arabian Peninsula has been, as I said, the focus of the incense trade for thousands of years. And they controlled the trade routes, and they traded with the lands of the Mediterranean, with Mesopotamia, with Persia, and even India. And frankincense and myrrh, which are gum resins that are native to Arabia, were widely valued in the ancient world for medicine, for incense, for perfumes, as well as for religious ceremonies and for funerals. And basically what the incense was, although there are many types, and I'm sure there were many types that were procured through trade links with the Indian Ocean countries, but the main ones that were produced here were frankincense and myrrh. And frankincense, I'm sure you all know, especially if you've been to Oman, is a resin, an aromatic resin from a tree called the boswellia. And it's used, as I said, in incense. And although it's known internationally as frankincense, it's also known as olibanum, which is derived from the Arabic luban. And this is a frankincense tree. It grows in the rugged mountains of South Arabia. And then we have myrrh, which is another resinous material, a reddish brown, collected from the dried sap of certain trees. And the original myrrh species is the Commiphora myrrh, which is native to Arabia, but also to the Horn of Africa. And again, myrrh has been used not only as perfume and incense, but also as medication, as it has antimicrobial properties. And do you know, people still use it today, especially here. And my cousin, who's a young, modern girl, she had an operation a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago, and it was a really big one, and she went to a very, very well-known doctor here in Kuwait, a Kuwaiti doctor, and her wound wouldn't heal, and she kept going back, and the weeks went by, and in the end, she was at her wit's end, he was at his wit's end, and he said, look, you're going to think I'm a charlatan, but why don't you make a myrrh solution and put it on it? And it cured it in a week. It's true. I sound like Donald Trump, don't I? This talk is about incense burners in our museum, which date from, sorry, I didn't show you the myrrh trees. You have to have a look. date from the 7th century onwards, so from the Islamic period. But incense burners, of course, have been around in this region for thousands of years, and many have been excavated in sites all around the Yemen and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. And in the old days, I'll tell you a bit more later, but they were made out of stone and limestone and alabaster, but also made out of metal. A few metal ones survive from the period because metal used to be melted down. Now, the kingdoms, as I said before, thousands of years ago, were extremely rich, extremely wealthy, had very sophisticated cultures, which really are very little known and understood. And it's only recently that excavations are starting to show what these cultures produced and how much power and influence they had. I mean, they traded with the largest civilizations around them, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans, even the Indus Valley. We all know Failaka had trade links with the Indus. And kingdoms such as Himyar and Qataban and Saba, but not only the ones in South Arabia, but further north too, up the western Arabian coast and along the Gulf Coast too. They achieved a lot in the arts, in many disciplines. I mean, one doesn't normally these days associate with this type of art with Arabia, but it was quite a common feature of the cultures. Those ones were from South Arabia, but this one is actually from Saudi Arabia, from Jeddah, the ancient city of Jeddah, and it's a funerary mosque, 3rd century BC. This is a Yemeni bas-relief showing a banquet plus a woman on a camel. That's actually from the very early Christian period, probably the 2nd century AD in the Arabian Peninsula. And this is a blend of Arabian and Greek, because that's Eros riding a bronze lion with the ancient South Arabian script on the bottom. Until recently, scholars believed that the earliest signs of advanced civilization in the peninsula dated to 700 BC, but excavations and research is showing that these cultures existed over 3,000 years ago. And in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, archaeologists discovered an amazing temple complex, 15 acres in size, a huge temple complex, which only 1% of has been unearthed so far. And this temple complex, which was used from 1200 BC until around the 6th century AD when it was abandoned, is of such importance to the region, but also to the world, that some scholars, such as one historian called William Glansman, suggested that this could prove to be as significant a site as the Acropolis is to Greece and even the pyramids are to Egypt. A very important site. And then there are other cities which have vanished into myth and fable, and with people until very recently doubting that they even existed. But new technologies have helped to unearth some of these. And here is an artist's rendition of one, which is in northern Oman, near the Saudi border, which is called Uba, and was mentioned in the Quran as the city with the pillars of gold, which was destroyed by God because of its corruption and its decadence, and which was also referred to by T.E. Lawrence as the Atlantis of the Sands. And this was supposed to be an extremely rich and powerful little kingdom. And for centuries, nobody knew whether it actually existed or not. And then some research teams quite recently, I think the late 90s and onwards, through satellite imagery, managed to identify an archaeological site and they discovered what they believe is almost certainly Ubar. And what they have discovered is that this city, a very long time ago, crashed into a cavern on which it was built. Those are some of the redone ruins today. So there was a huge limestone underground cavern which swallowed the city, and which was then abandoned. And if you look at the outline there, you can see there's a very strange octagonal structure around it, which artists have used digital imagery to show. Of course, this city was built on the incense trade. And yeah, so that's very interesting. And places like that are being discovered all the time around the peninsula. And this is just a map of some of the trade routes of the kingdoms, like Jera on the Gulf Coast opposite Bahrain, going up towards Kuwait, and then the important cities going up the western coast, like Yathrib and Medina and Taima up there. And I like this map because it's got similar trade routes, but it mentions the two Kuwaiti sites, Failaq and Sabbiya, which, of course, Failaq was an extremely strategic, before the incense trade even, it was a strategic location on the trade routes between Sumeria and the Indus Valley. Just a few more of the western side and the Yemeni side. Now, in ancient records, one of the earliest mentions of Arabs in other records are by the ancient Egyptians. And in the temple of Queen Hatshepsut near Thebes in Egypt, which dates back to 1500 BC, they have these bas-reliefs as well as inscriptions which talk about myrrh trees, which is what these men are carrying. These men are carrying myrrh trees from the land of Punt to Egypt because the Egyptians wanted to control the production of myrrh rather than having to buy it from traders. Now, nobody really knows where the land of Punt was, but most scholars argue over it being in the Horn of Africa, so Somalia. It's called Puntland today, but that's actually a more modern naming. So it's either Somalia or it's in South Arabia. And some scholars believe it's both, which I think is quite reasonable, because there were kingdoms actually which spanned both the western side and the eastern side of Bab el-Mandeb. This discusses or it shows the trade delegations that went down to the land of Punt to discuss commerce, much as one does today, and to form diplomatic relations. They weren't successful, of course, in growing their own myrrh trees. And the Egyptians, of course, they were probably one of the biggest users of myrrh. It was the most valued, more valued than in many other places. And next, we have references to the Arabs in Assyrian records, and they start from around the 9th century BC, and these include the names of rulers and various queens of the Arabs, which I found very interesting. And on one stele of an Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser III, in the 8th century, there's mention of the people of Seba and of Taima, a northern Saudi Arabian city. And it mentions that they were in a camel caravan with 100 people and carrying various goods, including spices and incense. And they captured these people and, of course, took them back to Assyria. And yet another mention, this time of the actual incense itself, which was myrrh, is in the annals of Tukulti Ninurta, and in the northern palace of Ashurbanipal, there are actual frescoes, which I'll show you in a minute. And they mention that myrrh was collected as tribute, mainly from the Arabs, because they were the traders who were carrying it. And these references indicate that there were strong trade links between Mesopotamia and Arabia going back at least to the 9th century BC, if not longer. The Assyrians, of course, like the Egyptians, were keen to control the trade routes, and they conducted many expeditions against the Arabs, most of which were unsuccessful, but they did capture many people. And they have in the palace the bas reliefs showing the Assyrians in pursuit of the Arabs who are on camelback, of course. I think this period was just about the time when the camel was first domesticated, which, of course, helped in the going from a maritime trade routes to the overland ones. So these all show, all these reliefs talk about the story of the raids against the Arabs, the capture of their caravans, and so on. And the link, this Mesopotamian link, lasted for centuries. And in fact, one Babylonian king, Nabonidus, lived in Tama in northern, what is today Saudi Arabia, for several years in the 6th century BC. And Tama at that time was a very important center of the incense trade and is one of the most ancient settlements in the Arabian Peninsula. And while there's much desert around Tama now, these are some of the ruins of the city. Thousands of years ago, there was much more water. There were even lakes, apparently, and much underground water still exists. The wells of Tama are, of course, very famous. Tama at that time, at the time of Tiglath-Pileser, was ruled by a Queen Shamsi. And she bravely but unsuccessfully resisted the Assyrians. She was defeated. She tried to escape, but they captured her and they took her back to Assyria, where they made her pledge allegiance to the Assyrian king, which she did. So they actually reinstated her in her role as queen of Tama, but with a governor in tow. And so in some of the bas reliefs in the palace, the records show some women, which most historians believe is Queen Shamsi paying tribute to the king of Assyria. And at that time, Tama was actually ruled not by one queen, but a whole line of queens. So the ruler before her was a queen, the ruler after her was a queen. And they're all mentioned by the Assyrians, but Queen Shamsi was the famous one. And that is the king that she, of course, had to pay tribute to, Tiglath-Pileser. And in his palace, the cuneiform scripts say, and I quote, "As for Queen Shamsi, the queen of the Arabs, 9,000 of her warriors I killed. I took 30,000 camels, 20,000 cattle, spices, weapons, scepters of her goddess." And spices, of course, referred to the incense as well, the myrrh. And as I said, some of the reliefs show a woman, this one here, who is thought by many historians to be Queen Shamsi, paying tribute. She's got some of her captured warriors behind her. And in this one, you can see she's carrying a bag, which is a symbol of her paying the tribute and incense to the king of Assyria. And yeah, and okay, the next important mention of Arabs in historical records is by Herodotus, I'm sure everybody knows, who wrote the famous histories. Very controversial, the histories were, because a lot of people believed that he wrote information that was based on myth or second-hand stories, although he claimed, of course, to have first-hand information of some of what he wrote. He stated that Arabia is the last of the inhabited lands towards the south, and it is the only country which produces frankincense, myrrh, cassia, cinnamon, and ladanum. He says the Arabians do not get any of these without trouble. The frankincense they procure by means of the gum styrax, which they buy in Phoenicia, and this they burn, and thereby obtain the spice. And he goes on to say that the trees which bear the frankincense are guarded by winged serpents, which screech horribly and are very valiant. Now, whether he actually went there and saw these flying snakes, I don't know, but some people say they could be a one of those horned serpents that one finds in East Africa. Who knows? And he says they are the same kinds of serpents that invade Egypt. And there's nothing but the smoke of the styrax tree which will drive them from the trees. The styrax that will drive them from the trees. And such then is the way in which the Arabs obtained their frankincense. And of course he went on, Herodotus, to give quite a detailed description of the region. And this is a map which is based on his descriptions, showing, of course, Arabia and Assyria and so on. And then Herodotus mentions laudanum, which he says the Arabs called ladanum, and he states that it is procured in a yet stranger fashion. He says it is found in a most inodorous place. It is the sweetest scented of all substances, and it's gathered from the beards of he-goats. So I don't know how nice that is. And it is used in many sorts of unguents and is what the Arabs chiefly burn as incense. And then following Herodotus, we have Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman historian and traveler who lived in the 1st century AD. He was also a commander in the army, as well as being a friend of the Emperor Vespasian. He wrote a massive work, which is probably the oldest surviving Roman work, and one of the largest books from the Roman period to have survived, called Naturalis Historia. And he mentioned Arabia and the Arabs and frankincense and myrrh, and he refers to myrrh as one of the ingredients of perfumes, and specifically as the royal perfume of the Parthians. And it's also used to fumigate wine jars before bottling and so on. And he says in ancient Rome, myrrh was priced at 5 times the price, 5 times higher than frankincense. And in those days, frankincense was literally the same price as gold. It was that precious. And he wrote at length about the trade, about the trees and the trade routes and so on, and about the people. And yet another source is the Perilous of the Erythraean Sea. Now, the Perilous is a document from the Greco-Roman period that lists ports and landmarks and routes to help sailors and navigators to determine their routes. And the Perilous of the Erythraean Sea is generally thought to have been written between the 3rd and the 1st centuries BC, although the authorship is unknown. And to the Greeks, the Erythraean Sea referred to not only the Arabian Sea, but also to the what's now the Red Sea and the Gulf. In the Perilous, there's a lot of mention of how long it takes to travel from one city to another. Like it says it takes 9 days to travel from the coast to go to a place called Safar, which is apparently an archaeological site next to present-day Yemen. And he says, and it's also mentioned the names of certain kings, and then it describes the frankincense kingdom further east, which is Oman, of course, and it describes the port of Kana, which is modern-day Bir Ali. That's where the archaeological site is, and also Kana is just down there, and you can see a town above it called Sabath, right on the South Arabian coast, and that's where the site of the capital of the kingdom of Hadramaut was, and this city, Shabwa, was founded in the 13th century BC. And it's mentioned in the Perilous that this is where the king lives. So, and then he goes on again at length to describe how the incense is taken over land to the port and then shipped out of that port all around, including to India. And very finally, we have Diodorus Siculus, who was a Greek historian who is known as Diodorus of Sicily. He lived in the 1st century BC. He wrote the Bibliotheca Historica, and this includes, again, descriptions of the region, including other places in Asia. And while he claims to have witnessed places firsthand, a lot of his work is apparently actually derived from the work of other people. And again, he wrote about Arabia, and he says that all of Arabia exudes a most delicate fragrance. even the seaman passing by Arabia can smell the fragrance that gives health and vigor. His description is very lengthy, so I won't go into it, but it's really interesting because, again, he talks about the trees, how the incense is collected, talks about the people, their houses, and so on. This is actually the city of Nineveh in Assyria, which was described by Diodorus Siculus, and it's a much, much later etching, of course, of the city based on his descriptions. And now one of the most familiar of artifacts excavated around the Arabian Peninsula are the incense burners, and there are many which exist from the 9th century BC on to much later periods, such as these ones, which date from between the 7th century BC and until the 3rd century BC, and most incense burners from that region and that period had, of course, religious symbolism, such as these ones, which has the religious sun and moon religious symbols. They also have inscriptions. It's not a very clear picture in the ancient script, and some of them, such as this one from Qaryat al-Faw, actually imitated architectural facades and edifices. And these are from Qaryat al-Faw. They also have other religious symbolism, which I'll also show you. Again, that's the typical symbol. These are from Qaryat al-Faw, but this one is from the 1st millennium BC, which is a bronze one, quite rare, because not many bronze ones survive, which has some serpents on one side, and it's got the ibex on the front, both of which are apotropaic symbols, meaning that they ward off the evil eye. And also they were symbols of fertility. And so a lot of religious symbolism in this incense burner. So incense burners of the Islamic period, which we're going to go on to now, hopefully we have time for our collection, reflect general Islamic art. And Islamic art, of course, is the product of the amalgam of pre-existing traditions and technologies of the lands that the Muslims conquered. So Greco-Roman influences and Coptic and Byzantine, Persian, Buddhist, Indian, everything. All these cultures taken together and blended with Arabian traditions created a new Islamic type of a style. And it produced a synergy, actually, of out of these cultures. And it became a unique style, which over the centuries developed, and with new developments in technology, of course, and materials became a very distinctive form in its own right. So even with the huge geographic spread of the Islamic world, generally an Islamic object, even though it comes from near China or from North Africa, they're quite distinctive. And the art is reflected in the motifs and the patterns and the calligraphic style. In our museum, we have several incense burners, and most of them are metal, of course, so I'm going to focus on the metal ones here. And during the early Islamic period, there were major metalworking centers in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, and Iran. And Egypt and Syria remained important centers for centuries to come. Iraq's prominence, though, diminished a little, but metalworkers in the Khorasan region of Iran and Afghanistan really came into the limelight later on. The Islamic craftsmen used several metals, including brass, copper, tin, silver, gold, bronze, brass, which I said. But bronze and brass are both alloys, of course. And various innovations were made by the Arabs, even though they did inherit old metalworking centers, including some in South Arabia. But they also invented modern techniques such as sand casting, which is a technique that was written about in great detail by al-Jazari in the 12th century, writing from near Mosul in Iraq. And some scholars have generally divided early Islamic burners into two major types. The Western type, which have Coptic and Byzantine influences, and secondly, the Eastern type, which have some Indian, some particularly Buddhist influences. And actually, some scholars such as Ernst Kuhnel, who's written at length about metalwork and even about incense burners, suggested that the Coptic influence spread as far as Mesopotamia. And he states that during a revolt of the Copts in 829 AD against the new rule, the leaders and the people who rebelled were deported to Iraq, along with their families and taking with them, of course, many craftsmen. And yet another historian, Agaolu, also a prolific and famous writer in this field, believed that the design of early Islamic burners was actually taken from Byzantium rather than Coptic Egypt. So Kuhnel believed the Coptic design influenced early Islamic burners, while Agaolu believed it was the Byzantine one. Agaolu supports his theory by making a comparison between the shapes of the burners. So with Coptic ones, they generally had big domes and small bodies, while the Byzantine ones, like a lot of the early Islamic ones, had larger bodies and smaller. But I mean, I've seen many pictures and artifacts, and I don't think that's really a general rule. I've seen many exceptions. And Agaolu also compares the, oh yeah, this is, you see, this is a large 12th century incense burner that we have in the museum, which is from Egypt. It's got, according to Kuhnel, it's got the Coptic influence there. What I was going to say is that Agaolu also discusses the feet. So he says that the Byzantine influence, which is that rib over the foot there, spread into Islamic incense burners. But I mean, obviously, according to their two descriptions, the incense burner I showed you is obviously more of a Coptic influence. And here we have actually a 6th or late 6th, early 7th century incense burner in bronze from Egypt, either late Coptic or early Islamic period, but even into the Islamic period, Christian symbolism passed through. So you can see some of the crosses on the side there along with the arrows and the flower on the top. Interestingly, none of the scholars that I was reading made very much mention of Arabian incense burners, and considering that incense, originated in the region, I just wondered why there wasn't a more important role in Arabian ones. And I mean, I found this one, which is a 2nd century incense burner from the Yemen. And I know probably there are some Greek influences in there, but I think it's quite a distinctive shape. It's got the dome, and on the handle there's a ram's head. So whether it's that not enough work has been done on Arabian burners or not, I'm not sure. And then this is an extremely interesting one from the 9th century BC, found near Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, and this has evidence of charring on it, and it has the bull, which was a typical symbol in the Gulf region in the Bronze Age and during the Dilmun period. So again, that's a really bad picture, but that's also from the Sharjah excavations, and they're in the Sharjah Museum. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done with incense burners of this region. And one of the early Islamic incense burners from our museum, which clearly has the Agaolu Byzantine influence, according to his description, is this Umayyad one from Syria, bronze, dated to the 7th and 8th century. It has domed cover, a lot of open work, including along the handle with an animal at the end, and it has some human figures too, which are not very clear here, but I mean, you can see some of the the animal figures like around there, and there's a human face down there, which again was typical of that period. And then next, we have an incense burner that fits very comfortably with Agaolu's criteria, which means larger body, smaller dome. And this incense burner is very special in its material and its shape and its decoration. It's brass and silver with copper, brass with copper and silver inlay. It's got open work and engraving. It's got animals at the bottom, plus warriors and musicians. There's a lot of work in it. And it's also got some, some of the Buddhist symbolism. This is called the eternal knot or the Solomon's knot. This incense burner looks like it is the type that was produced by the early metalworkers of Khorasan in the 12th century. And the animals that we see in there are quite frequently seen in Khorasan work. But our very own Dr. Geza did a lot of work on this incense burner, and he stated that this type of burner was made either in Mosul or nearby in Syria. And for his justifications and arguments, he discusses the introduction of brass into Islamic metalwork, which took place in Mosul in the middle of the 13th century. And he also stated that several similar objects from Mosul are known around the world, which are all decorated with silver and copper designs. Mosul was a very important metalworking center after the Mongol invasions of Central Asia and Iran in 1221. And Dr. Geza concluded that after the Mongols invaded, there was most likely a refugee from Khorasan who went to Mosul, established himself there, and produced this object there. And here is that's the Solomon's knot again. There's a collection of similar burners from the British Museum in London. And okay, next we have, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this before because I think I mentioned it in a previous talk. This is a Fatimid lion incense burner from around the 11th, 12th century. During the Fatimid period, which was from the 10th to the 12th, artistry reached extreme heights of quality and craftsmanship. And they produced everything from cut glass to cut crystal to swords and jewelry and chess sets and you name it, woodwork. But unfortunately, not much survives really of the high art from that period because of the revolts of the army in 1067-68, when the army was demanding to be paid, and they looted the palaces, and they either stole or destroyed a lot of what was there. So this is a very typical Fatimid ones with some Kufic inscriptions on it, open work, and it's a lovely piece. And look at this interesting piece, which is a similar shape, and which is housed in the Louvre, and which is said to be from Andalusia, but it looks very similar to the Fatimid one from Egypt, I think, the shape. I'd just like to talk a little bit more about the Buddhist influence in Islamic metalwork and in other arts and in incense burners. And in certain parts, of course, the Buddhist influence, especially in the Eastern Islamic world, was very prominent and very clear. And in our museum, we have several incense burners, mainly from Ghazni, from Western Afghanistan, from Eastern Persia, which demonstrate this. And this area was studied by a scholar called Melikian Shirvani in the 70s, but also by Geza. And Geza wrote quite a few articles about the Buddhist influence on Islamic incense burners. And they mentioned geometric patterns, plant patterns, lions, and mythical creatures, and so on. And they also mention how the Islamic metalworkers copied architectural styles. And in particular, they mention the stupa of Guldara in Afghanistan, And this stupa had, of course, the square base and the dome, and apparently it's been imitated in metalwork quite frequently. The earlier stupas, the early Buddhist stupas, were just domes or hemispheres, but later on they became more elaborate and had square features as well as domed ones, and all this was reflected in Islamic incense burners. And another typical Buddhist symbol which passed on to Islamic metalwork is the chatra, or the Chattri in plural, which we can see in this stupa from India in Sanchi, and on the top you can see the three little discs, that the chatra, and this is a multiple chatra, it's got three. And so this is quite a common feature on quite a few of the Islamic incense burners, especially from that region. And Geza states that the early burners reflected the Buddhist architecture a lot. And here is an incense, oh, those are the Chattri on the top. And here's an incense burner that we have in the museum, which is from Khorasan, 10th century AD, the Samanid period. It's made of bronze, it's got open work, and you can see, most probably that's the Buddhist knot there. It has an extra dome too, and on the top it's got a double Chattri. That's a typical Buddhist symbol. There. And then we have another one, which is a Ghaznavid incense burner from the 11th century AD, which is supported by 3 lions, and it has that interesting lion on the end. I'm not sure what it's for. It's got a blossoming tulip on the top, and this work is quite typical of the region, that zigzag work there of that part of the world. And now Geza and the other scholar I mentioned, Eva Baya, both state that square incense burners were less common than round ones were, or spherical ones, but they do exist, and here's a fine example of a square one. Oops. That we have in the museum, which is also from the 10th century, the same region. It's got a peacock on the handle, and it's got also peacocks on the corners, and on the top, which opens the lid. A very nice one, and it's got the hoofs on the feet. And this incense burner, Geza says, is even closer to Buddhist stupas. And according to Geza, this is a rare style, but similar burners do exist, such as in the Meir Institute in Jerusalem, but also in other places. Actually, he did mention one, and Geza mentioned one in the Dar collection, maybe not exactly like this, but a square incense burner. And okay, I'm going to skip that because of time, the next one, which was just an aside about this Egyptian incense burner in the Freer collection. I was just going to compare, how similar it is. This is an incense burner from Khorasan, 13th century. Again, it has the Chattri, but it also has a little sphere above that. And here again, this incense burner in bronze with the 4 lynxes, perhaps heads on the corners, and those you can't really see very well, but those are serpents in the horseshoe shapes there. I think probably you've all seen this in the lecture. I mean, I've got quite a lot to say about this one, but it's 4 minutes to 8. And so I've got around 5 different burners I want to show you after this. Now, this one, was studied a lot by Geza. It's a very interesting one. It's from Ghazni. It's not only deduced to be from Ghazni because of the research that was done on it, because of the, for example, the Buddhist symbols there and the animals which are typical of Ghazni, but also these palmettes there, which are typical of Ghazni, and they exist in the palaces in Ghazni and frescoes. Also the Chattri on the top, and this one was sent to the lab in Oxford, which confirmed the date of it. But there was also an interesting story, which I've told you before, about how the lab found that there was evidence of charring on it and then of calcification, which showed that it had been buried and was probably either in a building that fell down during the Ghurid invasions of Ghazni. So it could have an interesting but unknown history. And we have also in the museum, that's just the Chattri. This lynx-shaped incense burner, which is from the 11th century, also been studied a lot. It's signed by the artist. It says there, Amal Ali. And interestingly, there's a very similar one in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, which is signed not only Amal Ali, but Amal Ali bin Muhammad al-Taji, the full name. So whether it's the same person or not, one will never know, I suppose. This has also the typical Ghazni features, the palmettes, as you can see there. And it's got these two interesting fish, very similar to the lynx in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, which is quite rare. And it's also got the eternal knot on the back of the head. Very interesting burner. And I'm just showing you this dish, which is from Ghazni also, and it has the symbols of the palmet there. I was trying to find palmets from the palace in Ghazni, but I could find no record of it anywhere. So that's a very special incense burner. We have other lion ones too, such as this Fatimid one, which is from the 10th century, and this is another Ghazni one. They're much smaller. That incense burner, the lynx, was around this size. These ones are that size, so they're quite a bit smaller. Another interesting type of incense burner, mainly from eastern Iran, western Afghanistan, is this bird type of incense burner. They generally had a drawer in front in which one puts the charcoal and the incense. And similar things, similar birds exist in museums around the world, such as in the museum in Doha, and also in the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum. All have them. Now, we've got a few bird-like incense burners from that period. It's got some lovely engraving and open work on it. This is one in the Metropolitan. This is another kind of bird incense burner with the open back from a sort of a slightly later period. But what I found very interesting is this one. That's why I put it on the front page, because I've been looking high and low all over the place for similar incense burners, which are unlike the general incense burner, which has either the drawer in the front or open at the back. This one has a detachable head, like the lynxes or the lions. The body shape is a bird, but the head is a lion. And I tried to find any reference to something like this. I'm waiting to hear from Dr. Heba. Maybe she has some ideas. And this is another one also from that region. You see, this one also has the symbol there. And then I was just thinking, is it connected to the harpy, which is a mythical Iranian creature with a bird's body but a human head? Is it perhaps a modification of that? I put this in because we have a spherical one in the museum. And it's got a very interesting history because the Islamic world were selling these spherical incense burners to Venice, and Venice was exporting them into Europe, and they were used sometimes, like I saw one in the David collection in Copenhagen, and it's called a hand warmer, but actually it's an incense burner, and they've got a very ingenious contraption inside, which is called a gimbal, and you put the incense and the charcoal in there, and when you move it, it stays upright, which is very clever. So the Venetians were importing these to sell to Europe, but then in the 15th century, I think, some craftsmen from the Islamic world moved to Venice, they settled there and they started making them. And then the Venetians started making their own, which they sold to Europe as their product, but they kept the motifs that they inherited from the Islamic craftsmen. And this is actually a Venetian one, made by a Venetian workshop. And we have one here, which is a 10th century one. This is also from Khorasan. It's inlaid, open work. It has a gimbal inside, and it's got a thing, a little thing, a hook to hang it from the top. And then we've got two more. This is the domed incense burner, which again mostly comes from Iran. It seems to be popular in that region mostly. This is from the 11th century, made of brass with some calligraphy on it and beautiful engravings and open work at the back. It usually has a bird or an eagle on the top, but ours, unfortunately, has lost its one. Although we do have a ceramic version of it, as you can see the bird there. That looks like a harpy. And it's actually the color is much nicer than this. The photograph doesn't do it justice. And then finally, this is the very last one, a portable incense burner. And these my father bought from Sotheby's, and he bought two. And they were sold and labeled and described as portable incense burners. And there's evidence of charring in the top and inside. It's got flowers engraved, and again, I haven't found. I mean, to me, it looks actually more like an oil lamp than an incense burner, but I don't know. If anybody has ever seen one before, I'd be interested to know more about it. And with that, I come to the end, and thank you very much.